wasn't anticipating that. It was just I was on the shoreline, relaxing, enjoying a visualization when that happened. It doesn't always happen, but in that case it did, and many times it does.
And that visualization, I think, led to the cover of your
It
book,
did.
and you also have something there which kind of added to that concept.
I brought it along. As I mentioned to you, we create, or we live from the inside out or the outside in. And when I sat down to figure out what the cover, actually, as I started writing the book, someone had given me this book, I guess it's a pencil case. And I took it and I created my own little design for what I thought the book ought to look like, the world premiere of me. It's an old movie theater, which is where some of the action takes place in the book. And I put the world premiere of me, a novel by Fred Ford. And I kept this right in front of me as I wrote the book during this 8 years that it took me to write. And then when I handed it off to the designer, you can see the book is not exactly, the cover is not exactly what I created, but pretty close.
Pretty close.
You know, and that's an example of, a living example of creative visualization. I created that from the inside out, and eventually it took its physical manifestation in the world. It's from the spiritual to the physical, and that's the right order of things. A lot of us are living the opposite way.
Now, I noticed that each chapter has an appropriate quote, and I was amazed. I mean, you go from William James to Cervantes to Thoreau to Plato, and so on. So, how did you select that appropriate quote to start each chapter?
I
mean,
don't-
it's an eclectic, you
Yeah.
know.
I've seen that in other books where an author will put a quote, you know, before he starts. I don't know. I think a lot of that has to do with the Daily Fred, because I read so much and I have so much material that's floating around. When I started to do a chapter, I would think, you know, what quote would be great here? And a lot of times it would just come to me. Other times it was, let me find a quote through Google, and I'd just do a search, and I would find a quote and go, that's it, that's the quote I want. The quote at the beginning of the book from William James is really the quote for the entire book about, I forget even what it's about. The greatest thing, discovery of our generation is that man can create, you know, from his mind and into
The power of the mind.
The power of the mind,
Yeah,
and that's
yeah.
really a big theme of this book.
Also, scattered throughout the book, appropriately, are music and lyrics.
Yeah.
And as I said, I wanted to start this off with Sinatra's The Way You Look Tonight, but you have Glenn Miller, you've got the Beatles, you've got both Paul McCartney and John Lennon, and you know, John Philip Sousa.
Yeah.
And that was very interesting, I thought, very appropriate. Now, one of the things, and holograms, that's very important in the book,
Right.
very important. And I heard and saw a hologram of Roy Orbison. It was Roy Orbison. It wasn't a picture. It wasn't somebody impersonating him. It was Roy Orbison playing the guitar. Now, the music was recorded.
Right.
You know, it was a beautiful recording of all of his Pretty Woman and, you know, but what is a hologram? How do they make a hologram? How do they produce
I don't
it?
know. I know that
don't either.
the hologram idea, which obviously has a big part, there's
Yes,
a big
yeah.
plot twist here, but that's really an extension of our mind. There is a hologram that Duncan Ferris, who's a hero of the
hero,
book,
the protagonist.
he has his writing group, and he sits in a room with William Shakespeare,
Frank Baum,
Frank L.
Dickens.
Baum, Dickens,
like you say, DeMille, Cecil B.
Cecil B.
DeMille,
DeMille.
Ernest Hemingway,
and Walt Disney.
and Walt Disney.
And he sits there and he says, okay, guys, I got to write a script for a movie that's going to be shown to thousands of people. What do you got? And honestly, I have actually used my own mastermind group. A couple of those guys you just mentioned are in there. And that is a hologram of our mind. Their spirit is still alive. Walt Disney, William Shakespeare. And you can sit down, and I got this from Napoleon Hill wrote about it from a business standpoint. He wrote Think and Grow Rich, the book, among others. And he sits down with business people, and he closes his eyes and he gets in a very quiet meditative state, again visualizing, and he imagines being in a room with J. Paul Getty or Carnegie or whomever. And when I sat down with my writers group, sometimes nothing happened, and sometimes I got an epiphany. And I know it was because I took time to just sit down with these guys who are ever willing to, you know, share with their knowledge about storytelling. So yeah, the hologram idea is just an extension of our mind and what we have the ability to envision to serve our story.
Now, what is your the basis of your extreme affection and admiration for Freddie Patek. He appears
funny.
throughout the book. He, as we know, first of all, he was a shortstop for the Kansas City
Right.
Royals, and he was like 5'4" and 140 pounds, and was definitely an all-star.
Right.
What got Freddie Patek into
Freddie
this?
Patek. Well, the protagonist of this story that I wrote is Duncan Ferris, who's a 5 foot tall guy who's got a small size. He's got a small life, but he's a big baseball fan, and he always had a great vision, a great dream of being a big star. And early on in his life, he started to follow Freddie Patek, who was the shortest guy in the major leagues at the time at 5'4". He made the major leagues, played for the Kansas City Royals, among other teams. And one night, Freddie Patek hit 3 home runs in one game at Fenway Park against the Boston Red Sox. And he was only the second shortstop to ever do that, the other one being the immortal Ernie Banks from the Chicago Cubs. And Duncan kept that clipping and brought it with him everywhere to remind him that he was never too small to achieve. So Freddie Patek became Duncan Ferris's inspiration.
I got you. That's great. That was great. Now, one thing, as a former teacher, and as you well know, Duncan says, "School didn't teach me to think; it taught me to memorize." And I said, that may very well be the great failing of education.
Yeah.
Now, and you remember a couple songs that were like. We don't need no education. I think that was Pink Floyd. My son loved that. And then there was the Paul Simon. When I think of all the junk I learned in high school,
yeah.
it's a wonder I can think at all.
Kodachrome, yeah.
So that was a very telling comment. But we only have less than a minute, and I really wanted you to select just a brief passage that you would like to capture and convey, if you will, for our audience.
Okay. Well, the end of chapter. Let's see here. The end of chapter 2 is what I want to convey. Duncan has now done the tour of this magnificent studio. He's about to become the first test subject for this Hollywood mogul who's building a new studio in the Hamptons, right around where the studio
is.
Actually,
this is it. This could be the studio.
And Duncan, and it says, Duncan had spent less than an hour in the studio, but he felt he had been away for a decade on an unexplored planet. The visit left him exhausted and euphoric. The lines delineating the comfort zone had been annihilated. At the brink of his journey to be the first test subject at Eternal Sunset Production Studio, and God only knew what that entailed, Duncan's world had instantly been flooded with exciting possibilities. The range of emotions during his time with Grayson O'Day had risen and fallen to new highs and lows, seemingly from one minute to the next. He had been defeated, confused, exhilarated, shocked, dazzled, amazed, insulted, humbled, demoted, promoted, overwhelmed, and skyrocketed into a new dimension of thought. The shaft of light at the end of a very long tunnel had finally appeared. And yet, when he turned and walked from Grayson O'Day to exit the studio to resume his suddenly unrecognizable life, Duncan could feel only one distinct and familiar emotion: fear.
Well,
that sets
the stage for the rest of the novel,
Yes,
I think.
it does.
Yeah, and I don't want to give you the ending. I want people to read it, but thank you, Fred. That was excellent. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jack, very much for having
me. And I
me.
learned as much from this interview as anyone.
Yeah, I appreciate that from one writer to another. I appreciate that. Thank you.